Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. I feel like the one thing I don't want to ask you about is the alleged conflict or ideological opposition between film bloggers and film critics, but people love to bring that up in regard to you, right?
People still talk about that?
I don't know. It seems, do they not? Have they stopped? Is it over?
Well, I guess I should maybe preference our whole conversation by saying that I don't spend much time on the internet anymore, at least not compared to what I used to at all. I don't read comments, and I don't read film blogs, especially film blogs that seem to be about film bloggers and film critics, just because I realized how much of my time that kind of stuff was taking up, and I realized that I was not doing anything that wasn't work-related, and I wanted to have as much of a normal life as I could that wasn't related to stuff like that. So, but certainly I think that I was surprised when I got the job that I have now, which is writing for the LA Weekly. I was surprised that there was some kind of controversy that they had hired a blogger, because I had never thought of myself as a blogger. I don't know that anybody does, but I had only blogged instead of writing for a newspaper or a magazine because there were no jobs writing for newspapers or magazines, at least none that I could get. I tried very hard to get an internship at Entertainment Weekly when I was in graduate school, and I didn't get it. And so the way to get paid to write about movies at that time was to do it on blogs. And I don't blog at all anymore. So for anybody to identify me as a blogger now is actually inaccurate. But I also don't necessarily identify myself as a critic now. I don't really like to be locked into any kind of, title.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in Silver Lake, speaking with not a blogger, not a film critic, so she says, a writer about film, a coverer of the film world. It's Karina Longworth. She's the film editor at the Los Angeles Weekly.
I'm actually not.
You're not?
No, my title has been changed.
This is important now, because people are going to see this film editor all over the internet. What are you now?
Actually, my title was changed in June. I guess my title now is film writer, but I'm not the film editor of the Weekly anymore, and the Weekly actually doesn't have a dedicated film editor right now.
Breaking news 2 months late, listeners. She is the film writer at the Los Angeles Weekly. You might also know her as one of the co-founders of the film culture blog Cinematical. You might know her from her days at Spout Blog. You might know her from her commentaries on the show The Takeaway when she was in New York. You might know her from a lot of different coverage of the film world type enterprises. And I feel like I'm describing this unsatisfyingly. Tell me a little bit about how you conceive of the way that you work in the film world.
Well, Jim Hoberman, who was a professor of mine at NYU and was a colleague of mine until a few months ago when he was laid off by the corporate parents of the LA Weekly, he once wrote something that I thought was, very interesting, which is that the role of a critic or whatever is basically to be sending dispatches from inside the screening room of what it feels like to be there. That's as close as a description in words as to what I try to do with criticism as I've heard or found. But I also don't, my job is not limited to criticism. And in fact, increasingly, I feel like my job is to find interesting people and people who are making interesting things and sit down and talk to them and, basically have lunch with them and report back from that, which I imagine is a lot like what you do.
A little bit here and there, but you do review films for the Weekly, and you actively consider yourself not to be a critic?
I don't know. I guess I feel sort of uncomfortable calling myself anything.
But then you have to describe yourself to yourself at some point. Otherwise you just be acting randomly. You have a mission, don't you? We all kind of do, right?
I don't know. I think maybe when I was younger, I was more aggressive about my identity and promoting, and definitely promoting myself, but promoting a version of myself to the world. And as I get older, I am embarrassed by that and certain acts that led me to do. And I also I don't know. I don't know that it's that important. I guess the most that I can say is that at this point, I think that what I do for a living is not necessarily who I am.
I would argue with you and make you define yourself, but I've had the exact same process happen to me. So it's sort of like I have no leg to stand on there. What are these acts that you were forced to do by defining yourself, by carving out an identity before, in the mistaken days of youth when you were doing that?
I don't want to give the impression that I was forced by anybody else to do anything, because I certainly wasn't. But I think that when I was in my 20s and the internet was not quite where it is right now, but getting to the point where it is right now, it seemed very important to be living in that space all the time and to be asserting a presence in the space of Twitter and blogs and
to be putting a personality forward.
Yeah. And I sort of had to, I've written about this before, but one of the reasons why I gravitated towards Twitter very quickly, I joined very early in the beginning of Twitter, but one of the reasons why I caught on to it, I think, was that by tweeting and getting replies from people and having that conversation, it was a way of reminding myself that I existed. And obviously, it wasn't really important to remind myself that I existed. I wanted people to know that I existed. I wanted the world to know, here I am. I am a person who is interesting and doing things. And I honestly don't know if I'm embarrassed by that because now I'm 32 and, I've aged a little bit or what. But it's just not the way that I would be now.
Has it always been about film?
Well, I went to art school. My undergraduate degree, I went to 2 different art schools. And so I was studying film there, but it was not Hollywood film. It was not film in the sort of the way that I would study it later, getting a cinema studies degree. I was thinking of film just as a visual medium, basically. And I was interested in other arts. And going to graduate school to do cinema studies was definitely not something that I thought that I would do when I was 18 and I started going to art school.
How did you discover you could write about film?
Well, I think first I discovered that I could write, and that I was better at doing that than actually making things. And that would have started when I was an undergraduate, and I was making these videos. And today they would fit into the context of video blogging. It would be something you would see on the blog Keyframe. There's a blog called Keyframe, but also what I'm really thinking of is IndieWire's blog Press Play. Video essays about media and culture and film. And mine were coming from a personal place, but also an analytic place, and trying to merge the two things. And most of them involved a narration that I would write and record myself. And I still think that some of the stuff I was doing then was interesting, but at the time, between 2000 and 2003, there wasn't a real context for it. YouTube didn't exist. Art galleries certainly were not interested. They weren't the kind of things that you would see at most film festivals.
What would be the content of these videos? I'm having a hard time imagining it.
Well, I made one about my obsession with the Maury Povich show, in which I basically took on the voice of a character who had been sort of stoned into submission by just watching repeats of Maury Povich show over and over and over again, which was not really that much of a character because I did consider it appointment viewing when I was 20 years old. I would watch the back-to-back reruns every afternoon. And just that narration was the audio, and then the video was footage from the show that I had edited together in a very highly manipulated way. Because I was fascinated by this idea that there's an endless supply of women who have no idea who father their kids. And at that point, it was so early in the idea of reality TV that it didn't even occur to me that it could be made up or manipulated or anything. I just thought who are these women and what are their lives like? And I was trying to imagine what that would feel like. So there was that. That was one. And then there was another one that was about my obsession with the TV show Moonlighting.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. and then
it's kind of before our time, wasn't it?
Yeah, but actually that was something too that I just started watching a lot of because there were reruns on the Bravo network for a while. But my thesis film was actually about Judy Garland, and it was like a 20-minute film where I had extrapolated basically like 3 sentences from a book about Frank Sinatra about like the time when Judy Garland supposedly proposed marriage to him. And that line is like, that story is probably apocryphal. It's not in any of the Judy Garland biographies, but I just basically hypothesized, like, what if this really happened? Like, what would it have looked like? What would it have sounded like? And so there was a narration of me telling the story of what it was like, and then just a montage of images that I took from films. So I was doing that, and those were kind of going over really well with my professors, but they weren't going to lead to anything. I moved back to Los Angeles, where I grew up, after I graduated from school in San Francisco, and for about 3 months I was trying to get a job at the E! Network, because I was like, the only thing that my reel says that I can do is make an E! True Hollywood story, because that was a thing then. Like, there were E! True Hollywood stories on people like Doris Day.
And these videos were formally similar to an E! True Hollywood story?
That, like, in terms of the editing, they were they didn't have talking head interviews, but in terms of being just a montage of like a wash of imagery from a star's career, they were pretty similar. But then I just didn't really know what I was going to do, and I applied to a number of graduate programs. I applied to basically comparative media studies programs, and then I applied to NYU. And I didn't get into I didn't get into MIT, I didn't get into Brown, but I did get into NYU. And so the fact that I started going towards cinema studies rather than going towards media studies, and going towards sort of academic film criticism rather than making art about media, was sort of just an accident of the admissions process.
I've heard NYU described as a very cool place to go, but also something of a self-contained world with actively little to do with the world outside of it. Does that jibe at all with your experience there?
I think that all I can speak to is the cinema studies program. And I think that it's a really good program for some people. For me, it was difficult for 2 reasons. Number one, I'm sure there were other people in my program who were working 40 hours a week, but I seemed to be one of the few that was. And I wasn't working in an office job. I was selling cheese at Dina DeLuca. So I had like a job where I worked 40 hours a week, where I was on my feet, and then I would go into these classrooms that were, rather hermetic, and the dialogue in them was a little bit solipsistic at times. But also I found that the fields of study that, at least that we were engaged with in the master's program, I'm sure it would have been different in the PhD, where I would have had more freedom, but in the master's program, the required courses were very much about the past, and I was more interested in talking about the present. And now I think I would be able to get, I've focused on classical Hollywood cinema, and I love that stuff, but I wanted to talk about that stuff and also talk about contemporary stuff, and have the things be in dialogue, because Hollywood is nothing if not a continuum. And that was difficult to do there.
Do you think, and this might not make sense based on what you've just said, but do you think we are in as interesting a time for film as there has been? Or does the question not make sense because you're always considering the whole history, and it's sort of, like you said, a continuum? Can I ask you something like that? Like are we in a time that's still interesting, or does it not make sense to ask if this is an interesting time in film?
I think it's an interesting time. I mean, for me, that question becomes more complicated because I do write movie reviews every week, and some weeks there isn't anything interesting to write about.
Literally nothing.
Literally nothing. And also I oftentimes don't really choose what I write about, because you have to, or you do, but like of the 8 movies that are coming out in a week, let's say for the first week of September, I looked at a list in the middle of July, and I chose 2 titles to write about 6 weeks before. And so sometimes it's not always apparent to you what is going to be the thing that really interests you that far out. My boyfriend is a filmmaker. He's a writer-director, and he has a movie coming out soon, and it's a movie about time travel. And he's been doing a lot of interviews, and he has been getting asked the question of, like, if you could time travel to any era and make a film, what would you do? And he always says that he wants to make movies right now. I don't know. I don't know that one era is necessarily better than another.
Time travel is a very, very risky move for a film. I feel like that's maybe one of the most fumbleable premises of a film. I mean, of course that's his work and not yours, but as somebody who writes about films, oftentimes you'll see a time travel movie on the horizon and maybe not get that excited about it. Am I right?
I don't know. But why do you say that?
I just can't think of many films that use time travel to an effect I can appreciate. What are some really strong time travel films? What comes to your mind? What can you summon as just a real solid time travel movie?
I'm a big fan of the Back to the Future trilogy.
But even those, I mean, I think of them more as cultural objects than time travel movies. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think that they are thinking about time in a way that has been very influential, on both like a pop culture level and like a popular mechanics level. And I think that trilogy, it's not the only thing that you can point to for this, but it was pretty instrumental for people. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 32, and people about my age and maybe a little bit older and maybe a little bit younger to be thinking in a way that I think is very commonplace now, which is it's sort of the primacy of nerdiness, I guess. But in a way where it's okay to include scientific ideas in things that are very pop.
And pre-Back to the Future, there wasn't much of that?
I don't know. But I think that there's a sort of a, you might say it starts with Star Wars. I don't know if it really does, but somewhere between Star Wars and through the middle to late 80s, there were these event movies that were very formative for people who are about 30 now, that normalized those ideas, I think. Normalized the idea of having scientific jargon in a movie that's completely pop.
This idea of a completely pop movie, it's hard to think of a film more mainstream than Back to the Future, or one that's become more beloved, but tell me how do you categorize, do you separate films in that way at all, according to, this is a very pop mainstream movie and this is a very non-mainstream film? Is that a way you divide and separate, or is that also a continuum for you?
I think that I pay attention to distribution. I pay attention to where a movie comes from on a production level, whether it was produced by a studio or on an independent level, whether it was made in the United States or made by foreign filmmakers. But I don't necessarily know that I hope that I don't have prejudices about one way or the other. I mean, sometimes I think that it's important to tell people who aren't paying attention to things that aren't mainstream that there are things that they don't know about that they would think are awesome. At the same time, I don't believe in affirmative action. Like, I don't think that you should give like a little indie movie a pass because it doesn't have a big budget, right, if it's not very good.
They tried hard.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just think that's insulting. I think that's more insulting than saying, like, giving a film an honest critique.
One of the arguments for this time being particularly interesting is you do get a wider spectrum. You get bigger studio movies than ever, and you get more quote unquote small movies than ever. It's something some film writers don't seem to know how to handle, to group these all, to approach them all as, I don't know about equals, but all as even films. Like, the mindset seems to shift when you're writing about an Avatar versus I think of the film Cold Weather for some reason because Aaron Katz was on this show. But do you know what I mean? I mean, you don't seem to have trouble with that.
Well, what do you mean by mind shift? Are you talking about the tone of the writing, or? Well,
it's in the sense that approaching a film, approaching some event film that's going to make $1 billion and approaching a movie that may recoup its $60,000 budget, you want to treat them the same way, right? Or do you not want to treat them the same way? Do you want to actually approach them differently?
I don't want to approach them differently. But, I mean, sometimes you do end up approaching them differently because of a number of things. I mean, it's in terms of how many words are actually published. I mean, that's usually not up to a writer. That's an editorial issue. I've definitely written reviews of, let's say, more obscure films, just to have a way to describe them. And I've had editors be like, you're using shorthand. You have to explain who this filmmaker is. And you have to give a context for these terms about international cinema that you're throwing out there, because the person who comes to this paper to read the Avatar review doesn't know, who Claire Denis is. So if you're going to use a Claire Denis reference, you have to explain what that means.
It saddens me to know they don't know who Claire Denis is. How you mentioned bringing films that aren't mainstream to the attention of people who might not be paying attention to films that are non-mainstream. What have you learned about what it takes to get a Claire Denis onto the view screen of somebody who wouldn't otherwise know who she is?
I don't know that I've learned anything. I mean, I think that's a constant struggle, but it starts with talking to your editors and the people that are in charge of giving you space for these things. And sex sells for sure. Sex and social issues. If you want to get space to cover something that your editors haven't heard of, you need to sort of point out what's interesting about this object that is not just the object, last year at the Toronto Film Festivals, there was the Sion Sono film Himuzu, which was made by the guy who made Love Exposure. So then you can say he made a 6-hour movie about Japanese schoolgirls and upskirt photography. So that's selling point number one. Number two, it was made in the aftermath of the earthquake and made immediately. It's the most up-to-date movie about that disaster. So you can say these things that will appeal to people. To whom just saying Sion Sono's new movie doesn't mean anything.
Right. As someone who writes about a film, how far beyond the work itself do you consider it acceptable to go?
Well, movies are not made in a bubble, and they're not screened in a bubble, and they are objects in the world, and so I think that you have to consider the world that they were made in and the world that they were released in, and that is, one of the reasons why I do think a lot about the way movies are made and the financial conditions in which they're made, and also the world in which they're being released. And when I was working in New York, you get every movie in New York. Every movie opens in New York, and it opens there before it opens anywhere else in the country. And in Los Angeles, we don't get every movie, and there are a lot of movies that we don't get for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks after New York, and so it's
That may strike listeners as a little strange. Personally, I moved to Los Angeles because of the robust film-going culture. It's even a little surprising to me, given that I can't make it to half the screenings I want to here, that New York has more, and I do wonder why that might be.
Well, I actually wrote a cover story for the LA Weekly in early 2011 about some of these issues. Caring about movies means something different in Los Angeles than it does in New York. There is a cinephile community here, but it's a little bit more underground, and it's more diffuse. It's more spread out. There is not a single sort of meeting area in town the way that there is in New York, where all of the movie theaters that play cool movies, with the exception of BAM and Lincoln Center, are all centered around Houston. So you have the Sunshine and the Angelica and the Film Forum, the IFC Center, in basically a mile, and you can just walk between them, and there are very specific bars that you can go to before or after screenings. LA doesn't have that, and also in LA the conversation is dominated by the industry, and so in Los Angeles the merit of a movie is it's determined in the cultural conversation. The merit of a movie is determined on box office, the sort of cultural cachet of the filmmaker, not in terms of whether or not whether or not they're any good, but in terms of whether or not they're considered sort of a valuable resource, star power, things like that. And that's not, I'm not saying that that's what the cinephile community is judging things on, but that's what the general cultural conversation in Los Angeles is like. Whereas in New York, I don't remember having conversations about that stuff at all. When I first moved here from New York, it really felt like everywhere I went, all anybody wanted to talk to me about when they heard I was a film critic was box office and 3D. And those were two things about which I did not give a shit.
Yeah.
But now I've learned how to talk about those things in a way that doesn't necessarily betray who I am.
The 3D is going to go away, right?
I don't know. I mean, it's great when people use it purposefully, you know?
I saw Cave of Forgotten Dreams, but how many Cave of Forgotten Dreams are we going to have in our lives?
Right. And, you know, I mean, I love the way it's used in the one melee sequence in Hugo, and I just don't think it's necessary to have the dog jump out at you, you know? I mean,
They're still having things jump out at us in 3D movies? Because I've only seen the one.
Hugo?
No, I've just seen the Herzog.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that that is amongst the most purposeful 3D I've seen, but only in that one scene. And the rest of the film, it's just sort of tacked on because, you know, Martin Scorsese is not going to, he's going to try. He's going to try to make the most of it.
How much of a difference have you felt in specifically writing about film here in Los Angeles versus in New York? I mean, the film-going culture, as you've described, was obviously different, but your personal writing, have the places and their expectations changed it?
Well, in New York, I was writing, first of all, I was a blogger writing within a community of bloggers who were mostly people I knew or at least had met. And so there was more of an aspect of a conversation, and I wasn't being edited. Now I'm being edited. I don't have that sense of feeling like I'm part of a community at all. I'm friends with one other film critic in LA, but that's it. And my work is not just appearing in Los Angeles, but it's also appearing in New York and at all these other papers that the corporation that I work for owns. Most of the time, I don't feel like I'm speaking to people that live in the city that I live in. Occasionally, I'll write about things that are LA-specific, like that story about the movie theaters in Los Angeles and why film going is different here. And for a while, I was actually trying really hard to write at least one piece a week about something that was LA specific in terms of a repertory event, or I wrote about when they opened the movie theaters in Koreatown as part of that new mall. I wrote about that. Lately, I haven't really had time to do that, and part of that comes from the fact that my job title has changed a bit. But I'd like to get back to that place where I am thinking about LA specific stuff more often, because I do think that there is a film culture here, and it's, in a lot of ways, the repertory scene here is at least as exciting as the New York scene, partially because it's younger and it's a little bit, it's I don't want to say stuffier, because I don't necessarily think that, you know, sort of the French Old Wave series that Film Forum had recently, I don't think those are stuffy films, but you know, the LA scene is a little bit more midnight movie, a little bit more focused on cult stuff and weird stuff and stuff that, showing stuff in a movie theater environment that maybe does not traditionally belong there.
It's the vaunted freedom of Southern California, is it not?
Well, it's I don't know how much I'm sure you did follow Pacific Standard Time, but there was a lot of really interesting writing about how the work that was being produced in Los Angeles was different from the work that was being produced in New York at the same time, and I think that I don't necessarily like generalizations, but I think that some of those generalizations were pretty spot on.
I guess I should ask which ones you thought were spot on. I'm thinking of all the generalizations people make. I mean, there's so many. What struck you as particularly apposite?
There was one that I read, and I wrote a book about George Lucas, which is coming out in October, and I used a version of this quote in it, and I'm gonna mangle it, so I'm paraphrasing, but the quote was something about how in New York, when you were getting into abstract expressionism and beyond, breaking down forms, it remained cerebral, whereas the work that was coming out of California at the same time was sensual, and it was about perception, and you could say perception in the sense of psychedelia, or you could say just perception in terms of the way that things feel.
This is a question I'm sure every cinephile asks, so I feel like I'm asking it for them, but George Lucas, why?
George Lucas, why? Why did I write a book about George Lucas?
Why him? Why that subject? I mean, there's certainly, now that, you mention it, then I realize that the book about George Lucas has not been written. You've written it, perhaps, but... well,
there have been books about George Lucas, although nothing has been published in a while.
Right, nothing people point to and say, oh, that's the book on George Lucas.
And I have to say that I'm not sure that mine will be either. It's not a biography. I didn't talk to him. I wrote it for... Cahiers du Cinema in France has a deal with Phaidon, the art book publisher, and they produce these thin volumes called Masters of Cinema, which are basically overviews of a director's career, most of them from the point of view of a film critic. And so they approached me about writing something for their series, and I looked down their list of filmmakers, and there were filmmakers on that list that I actually liked more than George Lucas. Like I would definitely say that I'm a bigger fan of Wong Kar-wai than I am of George Lucas. But I thought that writing about George Lucas would give me an opportunity to write about certain things that I think about a lot, which are like, how did we get from the new Hollywood of the 70s to the blockbuster era to now? And George Lucas is a running thread through all that. And in a lot of ways, he's directly responsible for a lot of the aesthetic and technological and commercial changes that happened throughout that time. And I just thought it would be an interesting challenge. And it was. And, I had to watch Attack of the Clones twice, which is not something I ever thought I would do. So
it's a question that people ask, even George Lucas fans, perhaps not the most diehard, ask. And tell me if you think it's a valid question, but the question is, what happened to George Lucas?
I think that, well, you got to read the book, but there are a lot of things that happened in the early 80s. I do think a pivotal thing that happened was his divorce from Marshall Lucas, and I find her fascinating, and I would like, if anybody's listening and wants to commission me to write a book about her, I would love to. She has a competitive Oscar for Star Wars, and he doesn't. And he was very vocal in crediting her for helping him figure out story stuff and just mechanical stuff about the way his first films worked that he wasn't able to figure out. And then he went off to make Return of the Jedi. He went off to England, and she stayed back in Northern California, and she was assigned with supervising the construction of a new building at Skywalker Ranch. And she had an affair with a guy who was doing stained glass. And
it's always the stained glass guys, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always the stained glass guy. And so George came back, and she was like, "Look, George, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. Let's go to counseling." And he basically shut down and acted like a little boy and threw a tantrum and was like, "No, let's get divorced." It was the largest divorce settlement in California history. They had no prenup, and so she got half of his immense fortune, and she married the stained glass guy and moved away and has not been heard from since. And a lot of people would say that a lot of things changed in terms of who he was after that happened, in terms who he was as a person, how he thought about his work, his sort of confidence level. He didn't direct for a very long time. He didn't direct until he was pushed by a lot of forces, some of them not necessarily external, some of them definitely ego-related, to go back to Star Wars.
I'm hardly the biggest fan of any of the Star Wars films.
Neither was I. I never watched them as a kid.
I realize that people, even fans, think that the new ones are from mildly bad to a disgrace to the series, I suppose, to the extent that it can be disgraced, but it strikes me that the new Star Wars films, although I guess they're at least one of them's 12 years old at this point, the new Star Wars films are less bad to my mind than just strange and askew. I don't know. I don't know how you feel about that.
I don't think that they need to be a collective 8 hours long. I'll say that. But there are things about all of them that are fascinating, especially in terms of how he spent the 80s and most of the 90s in terms of basically being a hermit, living in the middle of this empire that he built. When you think about that, the fact that these are movies that are very fetishistic in terms of machines, and fundamentally about an inability to know what other people are thinking, and an inability to relate on a human level.
As soon as I read Anthony Lane pointing out how clean everything is in the Star Wars movies, I've never been able to stop thinking about that.
His review of Revenge of the Sith was, I think, something that opened my eyes to a way that criticism could be that I'd never thought of before. I'd never really thought of it as being mean. I'm sure I had read really negative film reviews before, but that review really feels like you're at a dinner party and you've had a couple of glasses too many of champagne, and some guy is trying to impress you by how witty he is.
And you thought Anthony Lane was mean?
Oh yeah, I think it's mean, but I also think it's just what's problematic about the meanness is that it's sort of meanness for the sake of meanness, and it's very clever, but it's also it's very self-satisfied as well. He's being mean, and that's making Anthony Lane feel better.
Ah, I see. Then again, He makes good points about the strangeness of the movie. I mean, it's hard to argue with that. Plus, glasses of wine, a guy trying to impress. It's the New Yorker. What do you want?
No, yeah, that's true. I mean, they're very distant films for sure. And what's weird about them is that like the human emotion that he's attempting for, like that Lucas is shooting for, is just, it's all about being like an 18-year-old boy, and he's never really gone beyond that. You know, like his even his movies that are successes, like, you know, the first Star Wars, American Graffiti, these are movies about what it feels like to be an 18-year-old boy, and he's never made a movie about what it feels like to be a man.
Even for filmmakers who you've been more of a direct fan of than George Lucas, do you worry about them getting too much freedom, too much budget, too much power, to the point where they, unconstrained, stop being what you liked?
I worry about the Dodgers getting too much freedom and too much power. I'm very upset about what's going on right now. But
it's a direct analogy here to sports.
Well, I do think that there's sort of like a flying too close to the sun thing going on with the Dodgers right now. And like, if anything, like what I long to do is like write about. I really love baseball in the idea that it's like a dysfunctional family drama that plays out in 162 3-hour parts. And I really want to write something about like at the end of this season, about like the grand narrative of this season. And that's more exciting to me right now than movies are.
Really? So how much freedom do you think you could get to write outside of cinema?
At the Weekly?
Anywhere, I guess.
Don't know.
I mean,
That's
blogging, you can do whatever you want, but as you said, you're a non-blogger now.
Right. And I mean, it's not, well, you know, I'm a non-blogger right now because I don't blog. Like, I haven't been blogging, but I certainly would blog if the occasion came up. I just wrote something for Slate. I don't know if they count as a blog. But yeah, I don't know. I would love to do stuff like that, though. I mean, I guess one of the reasons why I don't necessarily want to be like film critic Karina Longworth is because I want to write about things that are not related to film, and I want to have the freedom to do, you know, to follow my interests and to have interests that are not film related. But I mean, I have to say that, like, that's not a knock on the Weekly. I mean, they've given me, within the confines of a corporate newspaper, they've given me a lot of freedom. And I have a story that's going to be on the cover of the Weekly and the Village Voice in September, which is like, the fact that they just like let me run with it is pretty cool.
What story is that? What's the subject of that story?
It's about the demise of Kim's Video. Do you know this story?
Well, the listeners aren't going to, I think, so maybe we should just go over it.
So Kim's Video was like the best video store in Manhattan. It was on St. Mark's Place in the East Village for years and years and years, and they had a collection of 55,000 VHS tapes and DVDs. A lot of them were bootlegs or out-of-print stuff. You could find stuff there that you couldn't find anywhere else, and it became kind of a hub for a certain like generation of cinephiles. And then, but the rental business didn't make any money, and so the guy who owned it, Mr. Kim, decided that he was going to move his retail business to a new location and get rid of the rental business. And so he put out this public proposal that he was going to donate all 55,000 pieces of the rental collection to anybody who was willing to meet his demands. And his demands were that you kept the entire collection together. Like, you didn't just throw away all 10 rental copies of Shrek. Like, you kept it all together. You put some effort and money into like making sure that it didn't just fall apart. Like, you maintained it, and that you made it accessible, especially to Kim's members. And he couldn't find anyone in New York who was either willing or demonstrably able to meet all three requirements. And so he sent it to this village in Italy called Soleil in Sicily, which is on the top of a hill. And the village was basically decimated in an earthquake in 1968 and has never been built back up. But they had just recently elected as their mayor this guy, Vittorio Sgarbi. I'm probably mangling the pronunciation of that, but who was like an anarchist art critic and TV personality. And he was positioning the collection like he said that they were going to have an ongoing film festival, a never-ending film festival. They were going to have like the Mr. Kim Museum, and they were going to make sure that anybody who had a membership was able to just come visit the collection and take advantage of it and even stay in the town for free. So that the collection moved there in February of 2009, and as far as I can tell, that was it. That was all anybody had heard about it. And I don't want to spoil the story because it hasn't been published yet, Sure. But I went to the town And I found out what happened.
So listeners, if you want to find out what happened, pay close attention to the cover story. When is this slated to run?
I think it's September 14th.
Okay, well, there you have it, listeners. Now, I also want to go back to the other big story you mentioned, which is that story on the difference in the cultural conversation about a film in Los Angeles. What were the reactions to that?
God, what were the reactions to it? I think that one of the thrusts of that story was that this is a really hard town in which to just premiere a new indie movie, a new documentary, a new foreign film, and I think that everybody knew that. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the distributors for movies like that are based in New York, and they don't totally understand the climate here. And I think some of them like read the story and like were like, "Oh, now I understand things a little bit better." But that story in that sense was just sort of saying things that people in that world already knew, but that people who only go to the ArcLight maybe didn't know. And then the other aspect of that story was saying, like, so that's really tough, but at the same time we have this thriving and ever-growing scene of movie theaters like Cinefamily and the New Beverly and the American Cinematical, and like that is not dying at all. Like that's really thriving, and like maybe there's a happy medium where the distributors who want to reach the audience that's going to Cinefamily to see like 100 best kills, you know?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, maybe theaters like Cinefamily and the New Beverly can use their brands to help those distributors get their audience to see movies that they would like to see that are not, you know, enshrined in the canon, cult or otherwise. And so a big part of that story was talking about Dogtooth, the Greek film, which won a big award at Cannes, but opened in New York to dismal box office, and its distributor just didn't have the resources to really push into other cities. And for a long time, and it's probably still this way to some extent, if you bombed in New York, your distributor didn't even open your film in Los Angeles because they knew that at best the movie was going to do 60% of what it did in New York. So if you made 8,000 in your opening weekends in New York, like it's not even worth print and advertising to open in LA. But Hadrian DeLove from Cinefamily struck a deal to show Dogtooth for a week in LA, doing 2 shows a day at his theater, and it made a lot of money. And that was significant for that theater, and I think for other theaters around town, like the Egyptian, that they could show that their audience will come out to see these movies, if the conditions are right and if the movie matches their audience. And so you have seen a rise, I think, over the past year of repertory houses showing engagements of new films in ways that they might not have before. And I don't know that that's because of my story. I mean, I think it has to do with the success of Dogtooth, but that's something that I reported on in that story.
Do you think it's harder? I mean, you've mentioned that there's more available to watch in New York, easier to get to. Do you think it's harder to be a film goer here in Los Angeles, just generally speaking, versus New York, or do the film going cultures of Chicago and San Francisco, which you've experienced, rank on this scale at all as well? I mean, is it harder here? Is it more fun, less fun? What is it?
Well, Los Angeles is harder. Getting around LA is harder than these other cities that have great public transportation, you know? And I think that especially one of the things that hurts smaller movies that open in Los Angeles is the fact that, very few people in Los Angeles are going to go to the 7:00 Friday show of a movie. They're not going to show up on opening night because they don't get home from work until 8:00 on a Friday because they have to drive through traffic. And so you're certainly not going to drive to the New Art. If you live in Silver Lake, you're not going to be at the 7:30 show at the New Art because you're just never going to make it. And, vice versa. If you live in Santa Monica, you're not going to make it to the ArcLight by 7:30. So that hurts people. And so you have to think about things in a different way. And I do think that because of the transportation issues and the proximity issues and just the fact that people in Los Angeles, they park their car and then they don't want to have to worry about moving the car. And then there's the question of you don't want to have a drink after the movie because then you have to drive. And
this is why I don't have a car. It's too much. It's too much.
But I can't speak for every segment of New York cinephilia, but when I was in my 20s and I was sort of part of a community there, a lot of it was like you'd go on opening night to see an indie movie and everybody would go to like the 9 o'clock show at the IFC Center, and then everybody would go and have a drink afterwards. And that was like the fact that there was like 2 events to do that were together and related, and like you could talk to the filmmaker and like get to know people, that has a lot to do with fostering a continuance of culture. Like, it's this cool thing that people want to be a part of. And the cool things that people want to be a part of in Los Angeles when it comes to cinema, there's 2 really disparate spheres. There's like Chateau Marmont, like red carpet culture, which I don't think is that cool. I usually think it's pretty boring. But, I'm not demeaning anybody who thinks it's cool. It's just not my thing. And then there's like, Cinefamily and the New Beverly, and it just happens to be that the movies that they tend to show are not the same movies that people get excited about in New York. Like people, I'm sure that there are people who go to 100 Best Kills at Cinefamily who do want to see the new Claire Denis movie, but Cinefamily is probably not going to do a 1-week run of the new Claire Denis movie.
That's too bad. Who do you think is going to?
Maybe Sundance Cinemas.
Fair enough. I really don't want to miss any Claire Denis movie.
And I don't know why I keep bringing up Claire Denis, but
because she's one of the best filmmakers working today.
She's great, and I like most of her films, and I think that probably most of the people who work at Cinefamily also love most of her movies, but it's just not necessarily a direct overlap with their audience in the way that something like Dogtooth or Kill List or some of the music documentaries that they've given 1-week runs to, like those are things where like they know that their audience is more like the Alamo Drafthouse audience. It's not totally the same. The Cinefamily audience is probably like 60% Alamo Drafthouse, 40% IFC Center. But you have to be 100% IFC Center to play Claire Denis for a week.
Ah, yes. Irrespective of city and of film-going subculture, tell me how you avoid, or what you've learned about avoiding burnout on cinema itself. How do you not get desensitized? What do you watch to get yourself excited about the medium again? Because I'm sure you get unexcited every so often.
No, I have been actually really burned out lately, so I don't really know what to say about that. At some point you don't have the luxury of not watching anything, so you just, on some level it might actually be better for my writing, because the fact that I don't really feel passionate about much of what I'm watching right now, or that, like, sometimes I do really love movies that I see, but the act of watching stuff, I'm never that excited about going to a screening. But I think that makes me more objective in a way. Like, I'm starting from the same place with everything. And it's like where I'm starting is at a pretty low level of enthusiasm, but that might make the reaction more honest and less biased in a way.
Who are the filmmakers who got you excited enough to be willing to risk burnout?
Well, when I first started writing in a serious way, when I was going to school at NYU, I was definitely interested in mid-century Hollywood primarily. I really loved the Freed Unit musicals, Nicholas Ray, 1930s films, pre-code stuff, and then also right now I'm writing something about Mark Sanders's Top Hat, and I've always been really into the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films. So that stuff got me excited, and then as I said, I've always been fascinated by Hollywood as this sort of organism. I used my time at NYU, my 2 years there, to become, I feel, pretty well versed in mainstream Hollywood, from the beginning of the silent era, up through the blockbuster era. Moving into being sort of a weekly critic, well, first a blogger and then a weekly critic. At first, I was very engaged by the film festival world, for sure, and are we still allowed to say mumblecore? We're not, right?
I don't know. I interviewed Andrew Bujalski a few months back, and I was specifically told not to say the word mumblecore, and I said great, because I really was hoping he wouldn't say it.
Did he tell you about his computer chess movie?
His computer chess movie?
Yeah.
Is he working on a computer chess movie? Oh, well, what do you know?
I can't wait to see it. I don't know when it's happening. I think he's still editing it, but he shot it, I think, last fall. No, it was already shot. I think he shot it last August because I went to a wedding in Austin last September and I saw the production stills then. But he's a slow editor. Yeah, that's going to be really exciting.
Do you know the extent of the involvement of computer chess in the actual action of the film?
It's the action of the film.
Oh,
it takes place at a computer chess tournament in like a Holiday Inn, and I think it's set in 1981.
How can a movie like this not get you unburnt out about film?
That movie I'm very excited to see. I mean, the thing is that as a critic, you don't have the luxury of just caring about the 10 movies in a year that you would ordinarily really care about. Like, you have to see a lot of other things. And that's really where the burnout comes in of like, you know, seeing like 4 movies in a week and like having to write about 2 of them and just not caring about them.
Right.
But having to like, and that's why I say that I think that on some level the burnout is better for me as a writer because it forces you to be like to evaluate things in a way where it's like, it's not about what I like. It's about how the movie functions in the world and like what it's saying about the world that it was made in and the world that it's being released in.
Right.
And also just to look at it as an object, you know, like it almost becomes a writing exercise. Like if somebody told you like describe that plant, you know, like what would you even say? Like green, like leaves, you know, and then you have to get into the mode where you're able to say something more interesting than that.
It's true, but I wonder, I think about that, but also how I tend to enjoy critics or film writers the most when they're writing about what's important to them, but they're not necessarily saying something is good or bad or writing about what they really love. I'll use a personal example. So I mentioned moving to Los Angeles because the film-going culture is more robust than Santa Barbara's.
Right.
Hard not to be more robust than Santa Barbara's. One example is with the recent death of Chris Marker, the American Cinematic is doing a retrospective.
Right, and like I really, really wanted to write about that, and unfortunately I'm not going to have time to see as many films as I would need to see before I go to Toronto in order to write about it. But he was somebody who definitely, when I first started seeing his movies when I was in college, made me think about movies in a completely new way, especially in terms of the movies that I was making at that time. But going forward, definitely like on my top 10 list of favorite filmmakers.
Okay, well, you might have pre-answered my question, but I mean, Soleil, they're playing that. It is his movie from the early 80s, the one I've seen the most of his, the one that had so many resonances for me, is maybe the most personally formative cinema experience I've had. It's true for other people as well. But, I mean, to that screening, I will be taking somebody special and she will in this movie see essentially me in film form,
right.
And whatever she reacts to that will be her reaction to me, which is exciting, but also I'm scared shitless. So tell me, do you have movies like that where they are you in some sense because they formed your cinematic consciousness? Do you have any of those?
Well, I should say that like I was excited about going to see at least a couple of movies in that series with my boyfriend, who has just made a time travel movie with Bruce Willis. So it's obviously seen La Jetée, which inspired 12 Monkeys. And when I was in graduate school, there was a movie that I used to show like to guys on like the 4th date to like see how far this was going, and that was
this is going to be the 3rd. So we'll see.
That was Billy Wilder's "Kiss Me Stupid."
Yes. And reactions to that were in what spectrum?
Definitely, like I think a couple like, are we going to really watch the whole thing?
Then you knew. At least you knew.
Yeah. Then at least you know. Yeah. You know, I think that I've not really like sat down and thought about like what my favorite films of all time are since I became a professional. But what I used to say was that I had 3, and the number one was A Star Is Born, directed by George Cukor and starring Judy Garland. And that's definitely something that's a very personal film for me, and it's something that if people wanted to know about, especially about like what drew me to writing about cinema and thinking about Hollywood, that's something that I would show them.
What about it? What about it shaped the way you thought about film in that way?
Well, I think that movie is sort of the movie of Hollywood examining itself. And on some level, the movie is like heartbreakingly honest, but at the same time, it's a Hollywood production. It's a star vehicle, you know? So how honest is it really going to be? What it really is trying to do is sell and promote this myth that Hollywood loves to tell about itself, which is that there's like a finite space in the firmament, you know, in the galaxy, and for one star to rise, another one has to burn out. And like that, I mean, that is sort of this beautiful, tragic, and ugly, like, lie that it tells about itself that, like, also completely supports everything that's corporate and shitty about it. It's magical, and it's destructive, and it's entrancing, and it's awful.
Is Hollywood still Hollywood?
Certainly, yeah, sure. I mean, it's more corporate than ever. It depends on what you mean by Hollywood.
Is Hollywood still what fascinated you before? Like, is Hollywood what fascinates? Does it retain what fascinates you about old Hollywood?
Well, it's mutated and evolved. Certainly, I'm fascinated by the way that Hollywood is an industry like any other industry, and it's still an industry. It's still very much an industry, and in fact, like now, it's a global industry. And certain things about the way that it's outsourcing production is interesting to me. I'm fascinated by the fact that it's almost impossible to actually shoot a movie in Los Angeles.
I sure see a lot of shoots go on. Is that true?
Well, I'm sure that what you're seeing in most cases is television.
I do live on the block with its fake New York. Yeah. That's true.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of that, but on most budgetary levels, it's very difficult to shoot a film in Los Angeles. You can shoot if you're like very low budget or very high budget, but it's because there are no tax incentives to shoot in California, and there are just a lot of reasons why it's financially expedient to shoot in other places. So, you know, good on Louisiana for having tax breaks.
Right. They got to do the reimagining of Bad Lieutenant with Werner Herzog.
Well, I'm glad they did, because I like that film a lot.
You are about to take off to the Toronto International Film Festival. That's a strong festival. I mean, that's the one where you'll see, if you're going to see something interesting in North America, you're going to probably see it there, right?
Sure, you could say that.
So it sounds like I maybe couldn't say that.
Well, the thing about Toronto is that they show 300 films, and so you have to educate yourself before you go into it. Not that I wouldn't, you know, because I'm thinking about and learning about movies, you know, all year long, and so I go in there with a list of, 40 titles that are films that I'm going to try to see. But I think for an average person, it's a little bit more daunting, and certainly they are the kind of place where, like, I'm trying to think of like an example from the past, like Vincent Gallo's Promises Written on Water shows next to like Up in the Air. You know, it's like, if you're a regular person, what are you going to pick? Probably you're going to pick Up in the Air. And you know, you really should have picked Promises Written on Water, because now Gallo has decided never to show that movie ever again. And so, like, you missed out. And I'm not even necessarily recommending that movie, although I like it more than Up in the Air. But it's just that I think that you have Toronto, above most film festivals, is something that, like, the people who are already educated about film get more out of it than people who would like to be educated about film.
And how much education about film do you feel like you need to pass on when you're writing up something? When you're writing up something people need to know about, to your mind, or a film people need to know to avoid? I mean, how much of this is distillation of what you have picked up because you've been writing about film for a long time? I mean, how much of the task is that, where it's just get the knowledge across so this makes sense? Right.
Well, certainly there's some of that, and I mean, I think it goes back to the notion of criticism as reporting, in a sense, and so you maybe you don't do it in the way that you would in like a hard news story, but you do have to have kind of like a who, what, when, where, and why element to writing about things that people don't already know about. To get people to care about a movie they've never heard of, you have to treat it as news. And I do that because, and I don't want to condescend to a reader who, you know, would be inclined to see Up in the Air over the Vincent Gallo movie. But in the reality of the publication that I write for specifically, like, I have to assume that most of my readers are the ones that know who George Clooney is more than they know who Vincent Gallo is.
And that's a danger. I think even Los Angeles film scene boosters would agree that, yeah, I suppose you have to do that. But, you know, finally, what's What's cool about writing about film in Los Angeles? Is anything specifically neat about writing about it here, other than that there's so much production here that it gives you that angle as well? I mean, what do you get writing about film here that maybe other film-going cultures wouldn't offer, if anything?
Well, I do think that there's the sense of history. There's the sense of, and not necessarily in this sort of like rich, like I feel this history way, like maybe more in the way of feeling haunted by it. And also for me, like because I grew up here and then went away, I'm able to appreciate the city in a way that I maybe wouldn't have been had I just stayed or had I moved here in my early 30s. But I do think you get a sense of when you go to see movies here is that it's, God, I'm being really inarticulate. I'm not sure that I even really know what I want to say, to be honest.
No one does.
Maybe a different final question.
That's fine. I mean, the fact that it's hard to answer sort of it says something right there. I mean, it's kind of a confusing place. You know what I mean? Definitely.
And I when I did move back here in January 2010, I mean, my first year living here was really difficult, and part of it was that it took me like 6 months to learn how to drive. But it was definitely a hard transition, especially coming from New York.
And now?
Now I'm really happy here. I'm having like a Los Angeles renaissance. I really love it. And
you're out on the deck, helicopters overhead. There's no more pure Los Angeles moment.
Dodger game about to start. They're going to break my heart once again. So
I've been speaking with Karina Longworth, film writer at the Los Angeles Weekly. She is a co-founder of Cinematical, formerly of Spout Blog. You might have heard her on The Takeaway when she was doing commentaries there. Karina, thank you again for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thank you so much. It was great.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.